There's a lot you want to say. Just to kick off, I'll just say one thing. Isn't it, when do you think it started, this determination to keep the language as it always had been, which had huge emotional and political and personal fury? Jonathan Swift,
yes,
than whom no one could be, was so enamored of Virgil, because Virgil had written a Latin that continued for several centuries, and so alarmed that he couldn't properly understand Chaucer, that he set up a club to ascertain, to fix the English language. He enlisted the Queen Anne on his side, enlisted Dr. Johnson, which was a mistake, because when Johnson did his dictionary, he discovered that it didn't work. But nevertheless, he went to that sort of length just to keep it as it was. So there's an emotional component in this, isn't there?
Very much, yes. And I think it began in the 17th century, but it really hit its stride, as you note, in the 18th century. And there's a wonderful book by Henry Hitching on the history of prescriptivism, and another wonderful book by Lane Green on this. And it was tied up with, it was around that time that the dialect of English spoken in the south of England became the standard. It was literacy was spreading in the 18th century. The books became cheaper and more plentiful. More and more people were reading. There was also the rise of the middle class and a certain amount of class anxiety. So the combination of the imperative to standardize and sensitivity about whether you were from the right part of it, from the area around London and not from the north, resulted in a kind of a market for style manuals, many of which tried to outdo each other with increasingly stringent rules of how not to betray your lowly origins, how not to flout the newly emerging standards.
And lecturers went around places like this and taught people, and they came in there hundreds and hundreds to learn how to pronounce their H's. For
Yes.
The H was a big barrier.
And then, of course, that kind of reached its climax, at least in popular media, in Pygmalion,
yes.
where Shaw had great fun with Sir Henry Higgins.
Okay, that's enough of that. Right. For me, Now, who would like to ask a question? There you are, at the front. Oh, yes, we have microphones in waiting.
Thank you. If someone in one part of the world, like America, wrote something in correct English, is it possible that due to international usage that, say, someone in England or Australia would misinterpret what they've written because usage can differ in different countries?
Yes, there are a number of examples. Sometimes with comical effect, as in, the example I think most often circulated is when a gentleman in England says to a woman, "Can I knock you up?" In British English, that could refer to knocking on her hotel door to awaken her. In American English, it means to make her pregnant. There are many opportunities like that. There are others where I think there's little misunderstanding, but there can be a quick kind of boggle reaction, which, for example, I get whenever I hear something like, "The Guardian are dedicated to providing you with diverse content," where you've got a plural verb with referring to a subject that's an organization or an entity. "My bank are awful," or "Microsoft are bringing out new products." To my ears, that sounds like, "Is our children learning?" But it's generally acceptable in Britain. And then there are many other examples, even things like when my editor says, "I'll collect you at the hotel later." To me, it sounds like he's implying that I'm a bunch of smithereens that have to be kind of gathered up and put in a basket. In American English, you can only collect distributed entities. There's a long list of isolated entities like that. It's more severe with idioms, figures of speech, especially ones that are particularly recent or au courant. So a casual, slangy breezy writer will be harder for someone on the other side of the Atlantic or other side of the Pacific to understand, whereas more formal edited prose tends to be more uniform. So these differences are inevitable. They are. It is interesting for all the differences between American and British English, to say nothing of Australian and New Zealand and South African English. Despite their centuries of separation, they haven't grown that far apart, and they are almost entirely mutually comprehensible. And that must be due to the constant traffic of printed material, people, and more recently electronic material across the oceans.
There's a chap there, and then there's someone over here next, if you want to go over here. Yes, you.
As you said, there's no final authority in the English language, but that's not the case with other languages like French and German. And the Germans particularly love to go around simplifying language and simply abolishing things that people have used for centuries or decades are quite comfortable with. Has this made the language harder for people to learn, and has it made it less adaptable to changes in more broader society?
Yes. It's not all of the top-down edicts are actually followed by the population, and many of them are just ignored, except in official publications like government documents and so on. So it's always a battle between the bubbling, churning grassroots innovations and the top-down edicts. Probably, I don't think in the language as a whole, because I just don't think authorities are powerful enough to stop the introduction of new words. There are probably some constructions in which there is some awkwardness that's enforced by using the local French word instead of the English loan word, or restricting figures of speech that turn out to be useful. So I think probably at the margins here and there, but unlikely that the language as a whole can be that easily controlled. Oh.
It seems as though the rate at which we're acquiring words is definitely speeding up because of digital technology. And I was wondering if you thought the same was happening with usage and grammar. Are we seeing an increase in the pace at which things are changing grammatically? Yeah,
it's a good question, and I think more than before someone can answer that question, because we've got the easily searchable and classifiable text in the form of the internet, in Google Books and many other ways of using the internet as a kind of as a massive corpus. I don't know if anyone has. It's harder to track grammatical constructions than words, because it's easy to search for a word. It's harder to search for a verb followed by a noun phrase followed by a prepositional phrase. And there are some innovations. So, for example, the American Dialect Society voted as its word of the year the construction because X, like I believe in global warming because science. Now that, to someone at least in my generation, that just sounds wrong. But you do see it, and it is, I don't know whether it'll catch on, I kind of doubt it, but it has some chance of catching on. That, of course, is not a new word, but a new grammatical privilege of the word because. And that does happen not as quickly as vocabulary, which comes in very, very rapidly. Grammar changes more slowly, but grammar can change, and the hypothesis that it can go both ways. You can say that because there's this massive catchment area of innovators all throwing their innovations into the massive pool of English, the innovations might come more quickly. On the other hand, because they disseminate more quickly and they're less likely to get kind of entrenched in a local community and therefore become part of a local dialect, it may be that the rate of innovation is slower. And so it would be an interesting project for a computational corpus linguist. I don't know the answer.
This is actually a related question. I think there's a sense in business English and in financial English of it being used as a much simpler language because it's a second language to most people. And I just wonder whether there's been trends of that you can analyse from the past, say when Latin was the dominant second language or French was the dominant second language, that is kind of will dictate where the English language goes? And does that influence it enough to sort of state that it's going to get dumbed down because it's just being used in a simpler way?
Yeah, so that certainly did happen to Latin when it became a kind of vernacular, and often local languages will be simplified when they are the languages of an empire. I'm not sure that it'll happen to English, even though you're right that there's a vast proportion of the planet that speaks English as a second language. In fact, more people speak English as a second language than as a first language. Although an increasing proportion of people are trying to learn it at native-like competence. I suspect that because there's such a well-entrenched network of edited prose of the major newspapers and broadcasters and textbook writers and so on, that the language will resist being leveled by the need for others to speak it, although within certain contexts like memos, regulations, government web pages, simply to meet the practical needs of being understood by speakers of English as a second language, there may be kind of standardized, simplified forms. But I doubt that it'll drag the whole language down with it, because there's still hundreds of millions of primary first language English speakers who will keep all the words alive.
Just a brief interjection. Might it be that English is perhaps longevity compared with Latin, although that was long enough, and French, that was long enough, might be that from the very beginning, starting in this country, one of the strengths, I think, of English was the dialects. So its ability to become a dialect. So you get Singlish, you get dialects. In the Caribbean, you've got about, let's say, 20 different dialects of English. And it lends itself to that, seems to lend itself very easily and well, and that keeps it fertile.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. In a sense, there's no such thing as English. David Crystal wrote a book called Englishes, alluding to the fact that there are dialects. I mean, in the past, there were many more regional dialects, both in the United States and in Britain, which became homogenized with compulsory schooling and broadcast media. But now we are seeing globally a new genesis of dialects in places like Singapore and India.
And there are the self-conscious revival of dialects in this country.
I just wondered that whether you agree that the sort of underlying psychological state of the writer is often the reason for the way that they write, and that therefore perhaps an injunction to be confident, calm and candid would be just as good a way of ensuring that people wrote in a way that could be easily understood by others, that they've got something to hide whether they know it or not, or want to have it or not, in fact. Do you think that might be?
Yeah, so I think there is that adopting the right attitude or stance really is the first step in writing well. And it isn't so much that the writer has to be confident as the writer has to artfully fake being confident. And one of the reasons that bureaucratic and academic prose is so flabby and flaccid is that there is a reluctance to go on the record with any confident statement, especially in academia where the coin of the realm is being sophisticated about how difficult it is to acquire knowledge and how uncertain we always are, whereas the requirements of clear writing is a kind of naive realism, namely there is an objective reality, you can see it just by opening your eyes. It's that stance that leads to clear writing, even though literally it is not, as we know, the way knowledge is acquired. And if you're a sophisticated scholar or scientist, you don't want to pretend that you can just open your eyes and see reality. So there's a tension between the kind of fake psychology that a writer ought to adopt in order to write artful and clear prose, and the attitude that deep down he or she really takes. And that's why I think you don't have to be a brash person to write vigorous prose. You've got to know how to fake that brashness and that naturalness and that clarity. I quote the Dolly Parton, who said, "You wouldn't believe how much it costs to look this cheap." And so a writer has to put an awful lot of effort and artifice into writing simply and clearly and confidently.
Yes, that was Robert Graves said once about somebody was commending him on his history books, and they said they're very clear and simple to read, and he said because they're very hard and difficult to write.
So true, absolutely.
Now
yes.
up there.
There's one up top as well.
Sorry.
Oh, top, yes.
I wonder if you could give me some of your thoughts on punctuation, or what appears to be the decreasing use of correct punctuation, which of course is so complementary to the text and meaning. I mean, for example, with the split infinitive, dramatically increase, it could actually be got round by saying increase dramatically, comma. I find as well what is quite annoying, irritating, is the increasingly frequency that sentences are run into each other where there should be a full stop. What are your thoughts on how punctuation is developing?
Yes. So one should be very careful about saying that some usage is declining, because as those quotes that I reproduced at the beginning of the talk show, people always think that standards are declining. And in the case of punctuation itself was kind of a mess in English until it got kind of standardized in the early decades of the 20th century. And a lot of 19th century prose and 18th century prose would actually would be mispunctuated by the standards of today, such as the famous Second Amendment to the American Constitution, a well-regulated militia, comma, being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to bear arms shall not be infringed. That has the framers of the American Constitution put a comma in a place where an English teacher would say you can't have a comma. And so did Jane Austen in the famous first sentence in Pride and Prejudice. So, I don't think it's accurate to say that standards of punctuation have gone down. If anything, they became more rigid in the 1920s. They differ on the two sides of the Atlantic, and they also change over time. That there's a general trend towards lighter punctuation. That is, instead of having your page kind of fly-specked with all of these polka dots and little skittles everywhere, copy editors have been trying to pare down punctuation to the bare minimum. I agree with you, though, that properly punctuated prose by the contemporary standards of punctuation, and they do change, does certainly help in making prose flow, both because it can reproduce the melody and rhythm of speech, which is necessarily lost on the printed page, and because it can demarcate grammatical junctures, grammatical phrases. The problem with punctuation is that it's actually a pretty poorly designed system. And I have an extensive discussion of punctuation in the sense of style, showing that there are a lot of bugs in the system, cases where no one who would design a punctuation system now would design it the way English punctuation works. It's a bit like English spelling. There are a lot of arbitrary, infuriating aspects to punctuation, which is why errors are so common. A lot of the people who make errors in punctuation are not being illogical, they're being too logical, and they're not recognizing how many features of punctuation are arbitrary. So probably the most obvious example is the possessive its. So IT apostrophe S, it's, it's home, or its main problem is. If you spell it with an apostrophe, you have branded yourself as semi-literate. But on the other hand, when you think about it, apostrophe S is the way that the possessive, or more accurately the genitive, is spelled everywhere else in English. You say Bob's hat, Bob apostrophe S. You say the hat's brim apostrophe S. Why shouldn't you say its main problem apostrophe S? Well, you just don't. Someone in the mists of time just decreed that there's no apostrophe there. And one of the reasons I think that errors of punctuation so stigmatize a poor writer, logical though they may be, is that what they betray is a lack of attention to the details of the printed page. People who punctuate properly have spent a lot of time immersed in text, and they are paying a lot of attention to all of these bugs and irregularities and maddeningly illogical features of punctuation. So if you use it correctly, you've kind of run that gauntlet and proved that you've actually paid attention. If you make errors, it might be that you've just got too logical a mind, but you haven't spent a whole lot of time reading text. For all that, punctuation is well worth mastering, while realizing that there's no evidence that it has gotten worse over time, nor is there evidence that, that punctuation reflects a logical mind.
There's also clear evidence in some of the great works, predate Ulysses, for instance, or the great work that followed that, where he deliberately distorts, ignores, plays games with punctuation.
Oh,
and you have pages and pages without any punctuation at all. In fact, I think Will Self's last novel was one sentence.
Oh, yes. Well, in sometimes, I mean, that's true of all rules of grammar, meaning that they are sometimes deliberately flouted by a skillful writer in order to achieve some effect. So James Joyce, famously in the end of Ulysses, with that,
Olivia Plurabelle, yeah.
yes, and that where it's deliberately not punctuated because it's designed contrary to the goals of classic style. It's trying very hard not to be classic. That is, rather than the prose pointing to an objective reality, the whole point is to convey the nature of the stream of consciousness without all of that pointing to an external world, or that linear break of one word after another demarcated by punctuation. So all the rules can be broken by, even the legitimate ones, by an artful author who knows what he or she is doing.
And the problem gets even deeper when you think that one man's full stop is another man's or another woman's comma.
Yeah, yes.
And then you're in real trouble with your editors up there.
Yeah, hi. I have two questions, which is, I think they're not at all related, so unfortunately I can't. The first point is, much of what you talked about today, including the punctuation issue, is about written prose. And I was wondering whether how you think of that evolution, because most of how we consumed written prose was on paper, where you have to have a beginning and an end. It's two-dimensional. And then the only time I really consume content on paper these days is when I find a Metro-free newspaper on a subway or the tube. And these days it's all electronic on websites, and now you have this three-dimensional aspect. You can punch in and go to words you don't understand or concepts and so on and so forth. And I was thinking, perhaps in that example you talked about with the rabbit illusion, rabbit experiment, if it were hyperlinked to the original research, right, those who know about it can skip it. Those
or even a YouTube video showing the...
whatever.
Yeah.
So is there a next evolution in terms of how language is going to evolve in a 3D nature?
Yeah.
That's question number one. Question number two is, so we have an incredibly bright daughter with dyslexia. So struck by the fact your description of the passive voice and how it's a way to organize thoughts, complex thoughts into language. And she says, well, for instance, she says, I know exactly how I want to express it, I can say it, but it gets all jumbled up when I put it down on paper. So I was wondering maybe you could share with us any new ideas from cognitive science in describing and dealing with dyslexia.
Well, as to the first question, there isn't one digital medium, but many, and many of them differ dramatically from each other. So texting, for example, which is by design ephemeral and designed just to convey the minimum in the minimum amount of time, a little bit like the old telegrams, is going to economize on redundant words. Spelling doesn't matter. On the other hand, a blog post, a Wikipedia page, a Amazon product review will tend to be a bit more formal. And then if you're just reading the Guardian or the Times online, or a book online from Kindle, it's not even distinguishable from the standards of prose on the printed page. But you, in addition, you point to extra capabilities that electronic media give you, which I think will be and ought to be exploited. We shouldn't be afraid of it. When you, such as the excellent example that you gave of an obscure term being explicable via a hyperlink. And in fact, text is, even conventional dead tree text has always had to develop workarounds for the fact that it is two-dimensional and static. When you think about it, a footnote is a primitive hyperlink, and an index is a primitive search engine. The fact that we can now kind of do without an index, not quite, but and that footnotes are conventional footnotes ought to be completely obsolete, are just two of the ways in which we can use the resources of electronic media to enhance communication. Even the despised smiley face has its uses if it weren't so stigmatized by the fact that it came from the world of nerds and is embraced by the younger generation. But I have a wonderful style manual just called Style by the English scholar F.L. Lucas from the early 50s. Some of the older people here may have grown up with it. I think he was an Oxford Don. And in 1951, or whenever he wrote it, there's a wonderful passage in which he says, well, the printed page is just so limited, and what we really need is a punctuation character that indicates that the preceding sentence was meant ironically or in jest. So he's basically calling for the smiley face.
The idea is we finish about 8:30. We've gone past that, but there are two more questions. One was a question there, and then the final question, the lady up there in the middle. If somebody can get a microphone to her. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. I must say how much I've thoroughly enjoyed your lecture tonight.
Oh, thank you very much.
Even though most of it went over the top of my head, I still enjoyed that as well. But it's a little story about what I had with a publisher recently. I had a few experiences in life which I wrote about and sent it to some publishers, and the manuscript, they said they absolutely loved it. And they said they're going to get 2 top proofreaders to go through it, send it back to me, and then after that we'll sign the contract. And I was very excited about it. And the proofreaders came back to me with a lovely comment. It was a privilege to read your manuscript. I thought, oh, great. That was the good news. The bad news was they had to correct the grammar, which they did. And I read the manuscript after it was corrected, didn't even recognise my story at all, whatsoever. They'd lost the spirit of it completely, and I was very disappointed. Mm-hmm. And I didn't sign the contract with them. And what I did, I hired my own editor and proofreader. Oh yeah, I just thought it might be interesting for you to know that when something is corrected to a certain extent, you can completely lose the spirit of it.
Oh yes, that undoubtedly can happen, and a lot of the skill in copy editing is applying the rules judiciously so as not to flatten the author's voice or get rid of sometimes intentional irony or humor that may flout the rules for rhetorical effect. Yes.
A final question
yes,
up there.
Thank you. Just very quickly, are all languages equally complex? Or is it possible, or is it impossible to express or communicate some ideas in some language? In other words, to what extent does the language shape the capacity of the individual to express a concept?
Yes. So this is the question you raise is sometimes referred to as the hypothesis of linguistic determinism, namely, does the language you speak affect the thoughts that you can think? And I've written about that in 2 previous books, most recently in The Stuff of Thought, where I have a chapter on linguistic determinism. I think it doesn't, although that has to be qualified by saying that the language is itself not a static entity, and that the first part of your question, namely, are all languages equally complex, is difficult to answer simply because there's no one thing called the English language which every speaker has mastered. All of us have different subsets of this omnibus entity called the English language. One person may know technical vocabulary in science, another hip idioms bubbling up from the street, a third might know a lot of obscure literary words. English is the superset of all of them, and no one actually knows the entirety. And so it is with every language. And also because the boundaries of language are elastic, when there's a concept that you can't express, you invent a new word for it. You borrow it from another language you know, you invent a neologism, you have a circumlocution, which then gets compressed compressed and eroded over time. You have an acronym. And so there isn't a fixed enough thing called a language that could restrict your thoughts, although it may be true that, say, you can't have an argument in theoretical physics in a native language of the South American rainforest now, because they don't have the vocabulary. But if enough of those speakers felt the need to have a debate on theoretical physics, they would, over time, accumulate that vocabulary. So that's why it's a difficult question to answer yes or no. The reason that I gave a skeptical answer is simply because thought isn't the same thing as language. Thought is far richer than language. Even if your language does make it difficult to express a concept, it is possible to have the concept without the language, in which case you can extend the language.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sure we want to... Thank you. Thank you very much.